Tonight, I want to give you permission for something almost nobody gives themselves after 60. Not permission to rest more, though you should. Not permission to spend a little of your own money on yourself, though you've earned that too. Something bigger than either of those. Tonight, I want to give you permission to stop paying a debt you were never actually handed in writing. A debt you've been paying anyway, quietly, for decades, to people who never once asked you to sign anything. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. Get your tea or your coffee, whatever's keeping your hands warm tonight, because what we're going to talk about isn't easy to say out loud, and it certainly isn't easy to live once you've said it. But I think, quietly, you already know why this is the conversation we need to have. Somewhere along the way, maybe when your children were small, maybe even before that, in the house you grew up in, yourself you learned a version of love that was really just constant sacrifice. Be the one who's available. Be the one who says yes. Be the one who smooths things over before anyone else even notices there was something to smooth. And for years, decades even, that version of love worked well enough. It kept the peace. It kept the family together, or looking together, which isn't always the same thing. Nobody warned you that the bill for all of that would still be sitting on the table when you turned 60 or 65 or 70, expecting the same payment as always. You've read that last text from her 3 times, looking for a tone that isn't there, wondering if you upset her simply by asking a normal question about the holidays. You've caught yourself apologizing for things that were never yours to apologize, for a schedule conflict, a grandchild's tantrum, weather that ruined somebody's weekend. You've said yes to hosting Thanksgiving for the 11th year in a row, even the year your knee could barely manage the stairs because nobody else offered, and you couldn't bear the thought of anyone going without. You've watched everyone else's family photos online, the ones where a mother is clearly, visibly being cared for instead of doing all the caring, and wondered, quietly, what you did wrong, that your own life never quite looks like that. None of this is your fault. I need you to hear that clearly before we go one sentence further tonight. None of it. Not the guilt you carry, and not the exhaustion underneath the guilt. Here is the honest, uncomfortable truth I want to sit with you in tonight. There are 5 things, 5 specific, ordinary things that you have quietly been giving away for most of your adult life. Things you no longer owe anyone. Not your grown children, not your siblings, not the version of yourself that was taught a long time ago that a good woman gives until there's nothing left to give. I'm going to tell you exactly what those 5 things are. But before I do, there's something else you need to understand first. Because if I hand you the list without it, you'll do what you've always done. You'll read it, nod, feel briefly relieved, and then go right back to paying the same old debt by Tuesday. So let's start with why the debt exists in the first place. For most of your life, you were the one who held things together. Maybe you were the one who remembered every birthday, smoothed every sibling argument, drove across town at midnight when someone's car wouldn't start. Maybe you were the one who absorbed the tension in a room simply by walking into it and asking gently if everyone needed anything. That instinct wasn't wrong. It came from somewhere real, from love, mostly, and from a kind of quiet competence that made you the person everyone leaned on. But somewhere in all that leaning, something shifted. You stopped being a woman who chose generosity and became a woman who was expected to provide it automatically without anyone checking whether you still had it in you that particular day. You might be telling yourself that questioning any of this now, at your age, feels selfish, even a little late. It isn't. And I'll tell you exactly why that feeling is wrong in just a moment. First, I want you to notice something with me. A specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with your body and everything to do with a role you've been playing so long you forgot it was a role at all. Carl Jung had a word for the parts of ourselves we set aside, quietly, decade after decade, in order to keep other people comfortable. He called it the shadow, not because it's dark or shameful, but because it lives in the parts of us we've stopped looking at directly. Your own preferences, your own tiredness, your own honest opinion about where the holidays should be held this year. All of it pushed backstage so the family performance could run smoothly, so nobody else had to feel a single moment of friction. And here is the part that might surprise you tonight. The shadow doesn't disappear just because you've ignored it for 30 years. It waits. It gathers weight in the dark. And somewhere around this exact stage of life, it starts knocking, quietly but insistently, asking to finally be let back into the room. That knocking is not a crisis. I want to be very clear about that because it's tempting to mistake it for one. It is not your marriage falling apart, or your family falling apart, or you falling apart. It is simply the honest part of you, the part you set aside to keep the peace, asking politely, after all these years, to please come back inside. So why does this ache more at night than it does during the day, when the house is quiet and there's nobody left to perform for? Hold on to that question. It matters more than it seems, and we'll come back to it. A woman wrote to me last week, and what she told me hasn't left my mind since. She said that for 31 years, she had never once said no to a request from any of her 3 children, not a single time, not even when saying yes cost her sleep, money she didn't have to spare, or plans she'd quietly looked forward to for months. She told me she wasn't resentful. Exactly, she loved her children fiercely, and still does, but that somewhere around 63, she noticed she couldn't actually remember the last time she'd asked herself what she wanted before agreeing to what someone else needed. She said it felt less like generosity by that point, and more like a reflex, the way your knee jerks when a doctor taps it, except this reflex had been running her whole calendar for 3 decades. She told me she used to keep a small mental ledger without even meaning to every favor given, every plan canceled, every quiet sacrifice tallied somewhere in the back of her mind, waiting for a day it would somehow be repaid. It never was. Not because her children were unkind, but because they had no idea the ledger existed at all. She had never once told them what it cost her to say yes every time. She had simply said yes, smiled, and let them believe it was effortless. She didn't stop there in her letter. What she told me next changed how I think about this entire subject, and I promise we'll get to it. But first, I want to name honestly what's actually happening underneath a pattern like hers, because I don't think it's weakness, and I don't think it's simply personality. I think it's something Jung called a complex and emotional pattern, so automatic, so deeply grooved into you by repetition, that it runs on its own, quietly making decisions before your conscious mind even gets a vote. For a woman raised to believe her worth was measured in how much she gave, the complex sounds something like this. If I say no, I am not a good mother. If I put myself first, even once, I am selfish. If I rest, instead of rescuing, I have failed at the one job that mattered most. None of that is true, but a complex doesn't care whether it's true. It only cares that it's familiar. And familiar feels safer than honest, even when familiar is quietly running you into the ground. Here is where that letter writer's story took a turn I didn't expect. She told me that the moment everything shifted for her wasn't dramatic at all. Her daughter had called on a Sunday afternoon, needing her to drive 45 minutes to help move furniture, on the exact day she'd finally scheduled a long walk with an old friend she hadn't seen in over a year. And for the first time in 31 years, she opened her mouth to say what she'd always said, and something different came out instead. She said gently, "I can't today, but I'd love to help you plan a better day this week." She told me her hands were shaking when she hung up the phone, not from anger, from the sheer unfamiliarity of hearing her own voice protect something that mattered to her. Her daughter, by the way, was fine, a little surprised maybe, and quiet on the phone for a moment longer than usual, but fine. The furniture got moved a different afternoon, with help from someone else entirely, and nothing about their relationship broke, cracked, or even bent in any lasting way. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it's the part almost nobody tells you. The catastrophe you've been quietly protecting everyone from by saying yes to absolutely everything rarely arrives when you finally say no. What arrives instead, usually, is something smaller and far more survivable than you'd let yourself imagine. A little friction, a little surprise, and then, remarkably often, a small measure of new respect. Now, before you make peace with the idea that this will always be easy, there's something you need to hear first. It won't feel easy the first few times. Setting down a role you've carried for 30 or 40 years doesn't happen painlessly, and I would be doing you a disservice if I promised you otherwise tonight. There will be a version of guilt that shows up uninvited, right on schedule, the very first time you say no to something you would have automatically said yes to a year ago. That guilt is not proof you're doing something wrong. It is simply the old complex, protesting, the way any pattern protests when it senses it's finally losing its grip. If you've stayed with me this far, what comes next was written with you specifically in mind. Let's talk honestly and specifically about the 5 things you no longer owe anyone after 60, not your children, not your siblings, not the version of yourself trained decades ago to keep everyone else comfortable at your own expense. The first thing you no longer owe anyone is constant availability. You are allowed to have a day, an evening, even an entire weekend where your phone goes unanswered because you were somewhere doing something that filled you up instead of draining you. Being loved does not require being reachable every hour of every day, and a family that truly loves you will survive a few unanswered calls far better than you'll survive another decade of never once being unreachable. The second thing you no longer owe anyone is an automatic yes. Every request that comes to you to babysit, to host, to lend, to drive, to fix, to fund deserves an honest pause before it deserves an answer. Somewhere it's you asking yourself whether you actually want to say yes, not whether you're afraid of what will happen if you don't. That pause is not selfishness. That pause is simply you, finally showing up as a full person in your own decisions instead of a reflex in someone else's. The third thing you no longer owe anyone is the job of keeping the peace at your own expense. For years, you may have been the one absorbing every sibling tension, every unspoken family resentment, every awkward silence at the holiday table, simply by working twice as hard to smooth it over before anyone else had to feel it. Maybe you were the one who changed the subject the moment voices got sharp, who quietly mediated between 2 grown children who couldn't be bothered to work things out themselves, who left every gathering more tired than anyone else in the room, precisely because you'd spent the whole evening managing everyone's comfort but your own. You are allowed to let a little tension exist in a room without rushing to fix it. Other adults, including your own grown children, are capable of managing their own discomfort. It was never solely your job to manage it for them, and it certainly isn't now. The fourth thing you no longer owe anyone is an explanation for your own choices. Not for how you spend your time, not for how you spend money you worked your entire life to have, not for a decision to travel, to date again, to say no to babysitting on a Tuesday, or to simply rest instead of being useful. You are allowed to make a choice and let it stand on its own, without defending it to anyone the way you might have had to defend a decision at 25. And the fifth thing, the one I think matters most tonight, is this. You no longer owe anyone the shrinking of your own joy to keep the people around you comfortable. If something delights you, a hobby, a friendship, a late-in-life love, a loud laugh at something silly, you are allowed to take up that space fully without first checking whether it makes someone else feel a little eclipsed. Your joy was never a threat to anyone else's. It only ever felt that way because you were taught, somewhere long ago, that a good woman keeps her light low enough not to outshine the room. I want to be honest about something else here too, because I don't want you leaving tonight with the wrong idea. None of this means slamming a door on your family, or becoming cold, or punishing anyone for decades of a pattern that wasn't entirely their fault to begin with either. A boundary is not a wall built to keep people out. Think of it instead as a fence with a gate in it. Something with a clear edge, yes, but also a door you choose to open, on your own terms, when you actually want to. The goal was never distance for its own sake. The goal was always a version of closeness that doesn't require your own disappearance to sustain it. This is where something Jung called individuation becomes so important, especially in the second half of life. Individuation simply means becoming fully, honestly yourself. Not the role you were assigned at 22, not the caretaker everyone quietly assumed you'd always be, but the whole, specific woman underneath all of that. It's not a rejection of the people you love. It's an arrival at the person you actually are, often for the very first time since you were young enough not to know any better. Jung believed this second half of life carries its own entirely different task than the first half did that. where the first half is often spent building a role, earning a place, proving yourself useful to everyone around you. The second half quietly asks something else of you altogether. It asks you to come home to yourself, opinions, preferences, and all, rather than continuing to live permanently on call for everyone else's needs. I'll tell you something from my own life here, something I don't think I've said out loud in quite this way before. For years, I was the one who answered every single call from my own children. The instant it rang, no matter what I was doing, no matter what plans of my own, I quietly sat down to do it. And I remember the very first time, a few years back now, that I let the phone ring through to voicemail on purpose, simply because I was in the middle of something that mattered to me, and it could wait 20 minutes. My hand actually hovered over the phone. I felt something close to panic. And then, 20 minutes later, I called back, and the world had not ended, and my child had simply left a message asking about dinner plans for the following week. Nothing urgent, nothing that couldn't wait. I sat with that for a long while afterward, turning it over, understanding for the first time how much of my life I had organized around emergencies that it turned out almost never actually were. By the end of tonight, I think something in your chest is going to feel a little lighter, a little less obligated, a little more like it belongs to you again. Let's get there together. Here is the paradox at the center of everything we've talked about tonight, and I want you to hold it carefully, because it will matter for the rest of your life, not just this evening. The very thing that feels in the moment like it might damage your closest relationships, saying no, taking up space, letting your own joy exist loudly, is very often the thing that ends up deepening them instead. Jung had a word for this kind of reversal too, when something pushed to its extreme quietly turns into its opposite. Years of constant giving, carried past the point of sustainability, doesn't produce more closeness. It produces exhaustion, quiet resentment, and a version of you too depleted to actually enjoy the relationships you sacrificed so much to protect. But the reverse is also true. A woman who finally starts honoring her own needs, gently and without apology, very often becomes easier to love, not harder, because what she offers from that point forward comes from an actual full cup instead of an empty one running on fumes. Your relationship with your children, your siblings, your extended family is not made stronger by your disappearance. It never was. It's made stronger by your presence, your real, whole, occasionally inconvenient presence, opinions and boundaries included. I know some of you watching tonight are thinking of a specific relationship where this feels impossible, where the dynamics are so old, so entrenched, that even the idea of a small boundary feels like it could break something irreparably. I want to say this gently but honestly. If what you're carrying involves real harm, real disrespect, real repeated cruelty, rather than simple old habit, please know that protecting your own safety and peace always comes first. And no amount of family loyalty requires you to accept treatment that genuinely hurts you. But for most of you tonight, what we're really talking about isn't that. It's simply decades of an old unspoken agreement, quietly needing to be renegotiated, gently, one small moment at a time. So here is what I want you to actually do, starting tonight, not next year, not once you feel completely ready, because that day rarely arrives on its own. Pick one small thing this week, one request, one automatic yes waiting to happen, and pause before you answer it. Just pause. Ask yourself honestly whether you want to say yes, separate entirely from whether you're afraid of what happens if you don't. You don't have to change your answer the very first time. Simply noticing the pause is the beginning of everything else. I want you to picture something with me for a moment, gently, the way we do here by the fire. Picture a version of an ordinary Tuesday evening a few months from now. The phone rings, and instead of the small flinch of automatic obligation, you feel something calmer answer inside you. First, a genuine choice rather than a reflex. You pick up or you don't. And either way, there's no guilt sitting in your chest afterward, just a quiet, settled peace. Picture yourself saying, out loud to someone you love, "I can't this time, but I'd love to another day," and feeling, afterward, not smaller, but somehow more whole. Picture your own preferences taking up a little more space at your own table, your own opinions arriving a beat sooner instead of last, your own joy no longer apologizing for itself before it even gets to exist fully in the room. Picture, too, An ordinary Sunday morning, some months from now, where you wake up and the first thought in your mind isn't a running list of who needs what from you today. Picture setting your own cup down at your own table, unhurried, with nowhere you have to rush off to unless you actually want to go. Picture a version of a family gathering where you sit for once instead of hovering near the kitchen, where someone else clears the plates and you let them, without leaping up out of habit to do it yourself. None of this requires anyone else to change first. It only requires you, gently, reclaiming the parts of yourself that got set aside a long time ago to keep everyone else comfortable. If you've stayed with me through all of this tonight, I don't think that was an accident, and what I want to say to you now was written specifically with you in mind. You might be telling yourself that it's too late to change a pattern this old, that your family has known you one way for 40 years and can't possibly adjust to another. It isn't too late, and they can adjust more than you think, because the people who love you are not actually attached to your exhaustion, they're attached to you. Some of you watching tonight are the woman who has given and given and given again for so long that you've genuinely forgotten there was ever another way to love the people around you. I want you to know something clearly. Setting boundaries at 60 or 70 or any age at all is not a betrayal of the love you've given your whole life. It is simply love finally including you in the list of people it protects. If this is your story too, tonight I would love to know which one of the 5 things we talked about is the hardest for you to finally let go of. Tell me honestly in the comments. I read every single one, and I promise you, whichever one you choose, you are far from alone in it. If you're watching this tonight with a cup of tea nearby, or the television finally off, or the house doing that particular quiet thing it does once everyone's said goodnight, tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing where all of you are settled in while we sit with this together. You are so far from the only woman feeling exactly this tonight. Tell me I'm not alone in noticing this pattern in myself too. And let's remind each other, gently, that neither of us has to keep paying a debt nobody ever actually asked us to sign. And if what I said tonight found you at exactly the right moment, in exactly the kind of quiet where these things finally land, just comment the word enough. It helps me know these evenings are actually reaching the women who need them most. Before we let the fire burn down a little lower tonight, let me say the truest thing I know about all of this. The people who truly love you were never actually asking you to disappear in order to prove it. Somewhere along the way, you were the one who assumed that's what love required, and you carried that assumption quietly. For so long, it started to feel like fact instead of habit. They were only ever asking for whatever you could genuinely, honestly give. And it turns out that a woman who finally gives from a full cup rather than an empty one has so much more left over for the people she loves, not less. That is not a smaller kind of love. It is, if anything, the truest version of it, the kind that was never built to cost you yourself in order to exist. Come back and sit with me again tomorrow night. There's more I want to share with you, more of this fire left to sit by together, and I'll be here the way I am every evening, waiting for whoever needs this conversation most. Selfish. You are not too late to reclaim what you set aside. And you are right now exactly the whole woman you were always allowed to be.